In the ever-turbulent world of the bold and the beautiful, where love, betrayal, and impossible choices collide under the bright lights of Los Angeles, Daphne's sudden and emotional departure from the city sent shockwaves through everyone connected to her, especially Carter, whose dreams of building a future with her were quietly unraveling long before either of them dared to say it out loud. And as the truth slowly surfaced, it became clear that Daphne's decision to leave wasn't driven by a lack of love, but by a deeply personal heartbreak she felt she could no longer ignore, because despite the intense connection she shared with Carter, the late-night confessions, the promises whispered in moments of vulnerability, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could create something real together, Daphne was carrying a secret that weighed heavily on her soul. She couldn't give Carter the child he so desperately wanted. And in a world where legacy and family mean everything, especially to a man like Carter who had long envisioned himself as a father, this truth became an insurmountable wall between them, one that Daphne felt was unfair to force him to climb. So rather than watching their relationship slowly deteriorate under the strain of unspoken disappointment and quiet resentment, she made the painful choice to remove herself entirely, believing that leaving Los Angeles was the only way to protect both Carter's future and her own dignity. And though she tried to make her exit seem sudden and uncomplicated, those closest to her could sense that something deeper was at play, particularly Carter, who was left reeling by her abrupt goodbye, unable to reconcile the woman who had once looked at him with so much love with the one who now walked away without a proper explanation. And as days turned into weeks, Carter found himself haunted by unanswered questions, replaying every moment of their relationship in his mind, searching for clues he might have missed, signs that Daphne had been struggling silently. But the truth, when it finally came, hit harder than anything he could have imagined, because it wasn't about betrayal or a loss of feelings. It was about sacrifice, about a woman who loved him enough to step aside when she believed she could never fulfill the life he deserved. And that realization left Carter torn between admiration and heartbreak, unsure whether to chase after her and convince her that their love was enough, or to respect her decision and let her go, even if it meant losing the one person who had made him believe in something deeper again. And meanwhile, Daphne, far from the familiar chaos of Los Angeles, struggled with her own grief, questioning whether she had made the right choice, or if she had simply run away from a problem that could have been faced together. But every time she allowed herself to imagine returning, she was confronted with the same painful reality, the same fear that staying would eventually lead to Carter resenting her, or worse, sacrificing his own dreams for her sake, something she could never allow. And so she remained away, trying to rebuild her life piece by piece, even as memories of Carter lingered in everything she did, from the quiet mornings where she half expected to hear his voice, to the long nights where she wondered if he was thinking about her too. And back in Los Angeles, the ripple effects of her departure continued to unfold, with friends and family taking sides. Some believing Daphne had made a selfless choice, others arguing that she had underestimated Carter's capacity to love her unconditionally. And as whispers spread and opinions clashed, one thing became certain: Daphne's absence left a void that couldn't easily be filled, and her story became a poignant reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of love are also the most painful, because they require letting go of the very person you want to hold on to the most. And as the drama continues to unfold, the question remains whether fate will bring Daphne and Carter back together for a second chance, or if their love story will remain one of those bittersweet chapters that define lives without ever truly finding closure. The emotional aftermath of Daphne's departure from Los Angeles in the bold and the beautiful only grew more complicated as the days stretched into a heavy, uncertain future, because while her absence was physical, her presence lingered in every corner of Carter's life, from the office where they once shared quiet glances that spoke louder than words to the familiar they used to escape to when the chaos of their world became too overwhelming, and Carter found himself caught in a storm of conflicting emotions that refused to settle, anger at being left without a choice battling against a deep, aching understanding of why Daphne believed she had to go. And as he confided in those closest to him, He struggled to articulate the depth of what he was feeling, because how could he explain that the woman he loved hadn't betrayed him in the traditional sense, hadn't lied or cheated, but had instead made a decision rooted in what she believed was love, a decision that took away his right to choose their future together. And that loss of agency cut deeper than any betrayal ever could, leaving him questioning whether love should ever require such sacrifice or whether Daphne had underestimated the strength of what they shared. And yet, even in his pain, there was a part of him that couldn't help but admire her, because walking away from someone you love is never easy, especially when every instinct is telling you to stay, to fight, to hope that somehow things will work out. And that internal conflict became Carter's constant companion, following him through sleepless nights and distracted days where he tried to throw himself into work just to avoid thinking about the empty space Daphne had left behind. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the memories, the laughter, the quiet moments of intimacy that now felt like fragments of a life he had lost. And as rumors began to swirl through their social circle, each version of the story more distorted than the last, Carter faced an additional burden, protecting Daphne's truth while grappling with his own heartbreak, because revealing the real reason she left would mean exposing something deeply personal, something she had clearly wanted to keep private, and so he chose silence, allowing others to speculate while he carried the weight of the truth alone. A choice that only deepened his isolation but also demonstrated the depth of his respect for her, and meanwhile, far away from the familiar skyline of Los Angeles, Daphne's journey was far from the clean break she had envisioned, because leaving didn't erase her feelings. It only forced her to confront them in a different way, in quieter, more introspective moments where there were no distractions to hide behind. And as she attempted to build a new routine, to create a sense of normalcy in a place that lacked the emotional intensity of her past life, she found herself haunted by the same questions that plagued Carter. Had she made the right decision, or had she allowed fear to dictate her actions? Because while she had convinced herself that she was protecting Carter's future, there was a growing part of her that wondered if she had also denied him the chance to prove that his love was not conditional, that he would have chosen her regardless of the obstacles they faced. And that doubt became increasingly difficult to ignore, especially as she encountered reminders of the life she had left behind, couples building families, children laughing in the distance, symbols of the very dream she believed she could never give Carter. And instead of bringing her peace, these moments only intensified her internal struggle, because they forced her to confront the possibility that happiness doesn't always follow a conventional path, that love can exist outside the boundaries of expectation, and that perhaps, just perhaps, she had been too quick to decide what was best for both of them without allowing Carter to have a voice in that decision. And back in Los Angeles, the people who cared about Carter began to notice the subtle changes in him, the way his once steady confidence had been replaced by a quiet introspection, the way he seemed present yet distant at the same time, as though part of him was still waiting for Daphne to walk back through the door and explain everything, to tell him that this was all a mistake and that they could find a way forward together. And some urged him to move on, to accept that Daphne had made her choice and that he deserved someone who wouldn't leave him in such a painful way, while others encouraged him to fight for her, to see her departure not as an ending but as a challenge, a test of whether their love was strong enough to survive even the most difficult circumstances. And caught between these opposing perspectives, Carter found himself at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take, because moving on felt like a betrayal of what they had shared, but chasing after her carried the risk of reopening wounds that might never fully heal. And as this emotional tension continued to build, it became clear that Daphne's departure was not the end of their story, but rather a turning point, one that would force both of them to confront their deepest fears and desires, to question what love truly means and whether it is defined by the ability to fulfill each other's dreams or by the willingness to stand together even when those dreams seem out of reach. And as fate quietly began to weave its next move, the possibility of their paths crossing again lingered in the air, charged with the promise of either reconciliation or of heartbreak, leaving everyone wondering whether this was a love story destined for a second chance or one that would remain forever unfinished, a bittersweet reminder that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones made in the name of love. As time continued to pass in the dramatic universe of the bold and the beautiful, the emotional distance between Daphne and Carter began to transform into something even more complex than simple separation, because absence, rather than dulling their connection, seemed to sharpen it in unexpected ways, turning every memory into something almost tangible, something that neither of them could fully escape no matter how hard they tried to move forward. And for Carter, the breaking point came during an otherwise ordinary evening when the silence of his home felt louder than ever, pressing in on him with a weight he could no longer ignore, forcing him to finally confront a truth he had been avoiding. He didn't just miss Daphne, he still believed in them, in what they had, in what they could have, and that realization ignited something within him that had been dormant since her departure. A determination to stop living in the shadow of a decision he hadn't been allowed to make. And so, after weeks of hesitation and internal debate, Carter made a choice of his own, one that would change everything, because instead of continuing to respect the distance Daphne had created, he decided to close it, to find her, to look her in the eye and tell her that she didn't get to decide his future for him, that love wasn't about meeting every expectation perfectly, but about choosing each other despite the imperfections, despite the uncertainties. And as he began to set his plan in motion, those closest to him quickly realized that this wasn't a fleeting impulse, but a deeply rooted conviction, one that had been building quietly beneath the surface of his pain. And while some warned him that chasing after Daphne could lead to even greater heartbreak, Carter understood the risk, but also knew that doing nothing would haunt him far more, because living with unanswered questions, with what-ifs and regrets, was a burden he wasn't willing to carry for the rest of his life. And meanwhile, far from Los Angeles, Daphne's own journey had taken an equally pivotal turn, because just as Carter was finding the courage to fight for their love, she was beginning to unravel the very belief that had driven her away, as moments of clarity started to break through the fear and doubt that had once seemed so certain. And it happened gradually at first, in small, almost insignificant realizations, like the way she still instinctively reached for her phone whenever something reminded her of Carter, or the way she caught herself imagining conversations with him as though he were still a part of her daily life. And these moments, though subtle, began to chip away at the narrative she had constructed for herself, the idea that leaving had been the only option, the only way to protect him, because the more she allowed herself to feel, the more she started to question whether love should ever be defined by limitations, whether the inability to give someone a specific future truly meant that you didn't belong in their life at all. And as these thoughts took root, they brought with them a wave of emotions she had been trying to suppress: regret, longing, and a growing sense that perhaps she had underestimated both Carter and their relationship. And just as she began to consider the possibility of reaching out, of breaking the silence she had imposed, fate intervened in the most unexpected way, because Carter's determination to find her led him directly to her doorstep, creating a moment that neither of them had fully prepared for, a collision of past and present that instantly reignited everything they had been trying to keep under control. And when the door opened and their eyes met for the first time since her departure, the air between them was charged with a mixture of relief, tension, and unspoken emotion, as though the distance that had once seemed so vast had suddenly collapsed into a single, overwhelming moment. And for a brief second, neither of them knew what to say, because how do you begin a conversation that carries so much history, so much pain, and so much unresolved love? But Carter, driven by the clarity he had found in her absence, was the first to break the silence, his words not rehearsed, but deeply felt as he finally expressed everything he had been holding back, telling Daphne that he understood why she left, but that understanding didn't make it right, that she had taken away his chance to choose their future together, and that he was there now to take that choice back, to tell her that he didn't care about the expectations she believed she could meet, that what mattered to him was her, their connection, the life they could build in their own way. And as his words filled the space between them, Daphne felt the walls she had built around herself begin to crumble, because hearing him say what she had been too afraid to believe forced her to confront the possibility that she had been wrong, that love didn't have to fit into a predefined mold to be real or meaningful. And in that moment, the decision she had once felt so certain about no longer seemed as clear, replaced instead by a question that would ultimately define the next chapter of their story. Was she willing to risk everything, to let go of her fears and trust that what they had was strong enough to survive? Or would she hold on to the safety of her sacrifice, even if it meant losing Carter for good? And as the weight of that choice settled over them, it became clear that this was no longer just about what had happened in the past, but about what they were willing to fight for in the present, setting the stage for a confrontation that could either rebuild their relationship on a stronger, more honest foundation, or finally bring their love story to a heartbreaking end.